Ready to rock and roll? All righty. Good evening, everyone. I am Father Jan Schmidt. I'm the rector here at the Cathedral Basilica. So I wanted to welcome all who are present with us this evening, and also just kind of send out there an extended invitation to visit anytime. Mass here is a very beautiful experience of the Eucharist, and there are tours and things like that. If ever you would like to take time to do so, it's a very beautiful, very historical building, and certainly has a great meaning for us as folks who are here and born, raised, and are practicing our faith here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. So again, welcome to all of you. So a few things with regards to housekeeping. Those of you who might need to use the restrooms, they're straight out the door you came in and to the right. They're open, but the lights may not be on, but they should pop on when you walk in the door. That's important. You've got some snacks over here at some point. I see they're covered up right now, so they're off limits, at least for a little while. And I would ask that when things are through this evening, the building will be locked up, but you'll be able to exit through the courtyard. So there are lights out there. You'll go through the gates and you'll be on 8th Street. So I'm assuming most of you parked in our parking lot, correct? So you're going to want to make a left and just go right to the corner, walk right down along the back of the building. You'll get to the end of the building, make another left, and that'll take you right out to the parking lot. Okay? So everybody can find their way easily home and not be lost in downtown Cincinnati here. So we have this evening Father Aaron Wessman, who is with Glenmary. Those of you who may not be familiar, Glenmary is based in Fairfield, which is just a little bit north of our city. And it is great to have him with us this evening. I think, you know, you're here because you have some perhaps concern about the polarization that does exist in our culture, our society here in the United States. We're approaching here in a few months an election that will probably cause even more contention than it is right now. And it's important that we talk about this and that we try to, you know, to be the leaven, so to speak, in the bread to help calm things down, to bring Christ's presence into every place that we find ourselves. And so this is the beginning of a 6-point series on polarization. I'm hopeful that everybody will be able to attend all, and others will join along the way as well. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Jill, who will do the introductions, and we'll be moving along here quickly. Thank you all again for being here, and do know that you're always welcome.
Thank you, Father Jan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for those who are joining us online as well. My name is Jill Foster. I'm Regional Director for Catholic Social Action in the Dayton and Northern area for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. As part of our efforts to address the growing polarization in our Archdiocese, particularly during this election year where tensions are very high, we're putting together a series of programs to fall under the title Our Eucharistic Mission in a Polarized World, which is the name which is based off of Father Aaron Wessman's book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World, and whom I will introduce shortly. For the next 12 months or so, leading up to and following the election, we hope to provide a number of skills building and educational workshops and presentations to everyone in the Archdiocese, whether you're a part of the faith or not, in an effort to heal our divided communities and nation. The Church has spoken about this polarization already, and the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops responded to Pope Francis's calls for a better kind of politics with a movement called Civilize It. So to kick off our Eucharistic mission in a polarized world, it's my pleasure to introduce this series on polarization in the Eucharist. I want to thank all our collaborators for helping us organize this series, including the Liturgy Office, the Respect Life Office, the Mission Office, Bellarmine Chapel, and Xavier University, all our hosting parishes, and most especially the Glenmary Home Missioners. This is the first installment, as Father Jan mentioned, of 6 different presentations on polarization in the Eucharist based off of Father Aaron Wessman's book. And the presentations are being hosted once a month at different parishes in the Archdiocese And all are welcome to join us in person through a Zoom live stream, and all the presentations are being recorded so anyone can go back and watch them once they're posted. So without further ado, I'm honored to present our speaker who has graciously given us time out of his busy schedule, not just for this presentation, but for the entire series, Father Aaron Wessman, who is the Vicar and Director of Formation for the Glenmary Home Missioner since 2019. He has a PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain in systematic theology and is a guest lecturer at the St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology. Father Aaron serves on the editorial board for review for religious and the advisory board for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men Religious. He gives lectures and publishes regularly on the theme of Christianity and polarization, including his recent book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World, published by New City Press. And he serves 2 prison systems in the Cincinnati, Ohio region. So it's been a pleasure planning this with Father Aaron these past few months, and I would love for you to join me in welcoming him for this introductory presentation, The Eucharist, an Antidote to Polarization.
Thank you so much, Jill, and a special thanks to you and to Andrew as well, and the Office of Catholic Social Action. I gave a retreat to the missionaries of the Precious Blood. I think it was probably back in around February, something to that effect of this year. And, you know, like most religious communities, whenever there's a religious community gathering, they tend to skew just a little bit, let's say, older, right? A little bit older. And that was the case. And it was mostly priests and brothers, but there were also some lay associates of the missionaries of the Precious Blood. And then I saw this youngish person sitting in the back, namely Jill. And I'm kind of thinking, why is she here? What is she? I thought she was spying on me for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. It turns out she maybe was. See if this guy's crazy or not. Well, I think I passed the crazy test. I don't know. I'm not sure about that, because she approached me later on and said, you know, it was really interesting being part of that retreat and the themes that you touched on, particularly looking at polarization, relating that to the Eucharist. Would you be interested in doing something more with the Archdiocese of Cincinnati? So I'm so happy that you were there, and I'm honored that you approached me and asked to do this. So thank you very much. Also, just to say, I think Father Jan stepped out, but I want to say thanks to him. You know, I've served as a pastor. I've never had the august opportunity to serve as a rector of a cathedral. But I know it's always a little bit risky bringing in an outside speaker. You know, you don't know what the person's going to say. You're wondering, who's that skinny priest with that tall, pointy hair? You know, what is he going to do? What's going on? But anyway, I really appreciate the fact that he was willing to take the risk to host the first of these events. And I pray that I don't disappoint you all, and also don't disappoint him as well. And then I just want to say thank you for being here. You probably had a lot of other things to do on a Thursday evening. And I'm just honored by your presence. I'm excited about this theme and this topic. I'm going to say more about that as we go along. I'm going to be interested very much in hearing from your perspective and some of your struggles and some of your challenges. But you all decided to come and be part of these series of talks, especially this one. And it's not easy to do that, particularly with a theme of polarization. So just think about, when you hear the word polarization, when you hear the word politics, when you hear the word partisanship, when you hear the word election, what emotions kind of stir within your own hearts? What emotions do you feel inside? And feel free to just kind of shout them out if you want. Disappointment. Frustration.
I hope it's not too late.
Hope it's not too late, yes.
I'm just thinking about how far away. I'm thinking like Poland, so far away from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Feeling that like separation, really that distance, absolutely. Sadness, yes. Other emotions? They tend to be very heavy emotions, right? They tend to be very negative emotions. And just to give you a sense, so yesterday with my Glenmary community, the community that I belong to, we all sat together. There was about 10, 12 of us in the living room of the residence where I live. And we brought in a facilitator, an expert in the area. I'm not really an expert, but this guy was an expert in the area of polarization and actually facilitating groups, right? We talked about how we are feeling right now during this election cycle and how we feel about politics and how we feel about polarization. And we echoed similar feelings that people mentioned here. So I say that in as much as that I think there's a solidarity that we can feel with these big emotions. I say that to say that we in Glenmary and myself, that I'm still trying to work through this stuff. So I think I've done some research on the subject and I'm excited to share that, but it's something that I still struggle with, and that's still a challenge for me. So I'm no way coming here having everything put together in my own life. But based on the fact that this is all so heavy, I think it requires us to turn to God with an intensity in our prayer. So I'd like to begin, if you will, with a prayer. And this particular prayer is one that has emerged. I know the words are somewhat small on the screen there, but I'm going to read this out so we'll be able to hear it. This prayer emerged over the last year or so as I've been talking to groups throughout the United States, as I've been thinking about this challenge of polarization, as I've been thinking about what it means for us to be missionary disciples in a polarized world, and especially what is it that Jesus is inviting us to do at this time? So there's a part for you all to respond. If you're online, you can respond, and please do so here. And your response will be, help us to be one. So we pray in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus, in your life, you crossed over to the outcast, and we say, help us to be one. In your teaching, you commanded us to love our enemy. Help us to be one. Before your supper, you washed the feet of those who would deny you. Help us to be one. Before your sacrifice, you prayed for unity. Help us to be one. On the cross, you brought together what had been lost. Help us to be one. In your death, you touched those in darkness. Help us to be one. After your resurrection, you returned to those who had abandoned you. Help us to be one. In pouring out your Spirit, you made the church the sacrament of unity. Help us to be one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So to give you just a little bit of a sense of what I hope to try to do together, there's really going to be three parts to this presentation. The first is I'm just going to talk a little bit about who I am, not to be self-centered, not to be egotistical in any way, but I just want to give you a sense of where I stand and why the theme of polarization has become kind of so important to me in my ministry and my life as a priest and as a Glenmarian. And then I'm going to talk about what are the big questions for this particular series. Now, how many of you out there are looking for answers? Anybody looking for answers? Okay, a couple people out there, a few people, very good. So I promise you there will be answers, but in this introductory talk, there's going to be more questions than answers, because I think it's always important for us to get the question right if we really desire to start thinking about what the actual answer is to the challenge that we are facing. So I think there's a lot of wisdom, if you will, in the questions. So I'm going to raise some really important questions that I have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with, questions that I've addressed in the book that I wrote, and questions that we'll see and address as we go throughout the next 6 months in this series of talks. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Eucharist particularly, and how the Eucharist can kind of help us move forward giving sort of a broad introduction to each of the talks that'll take place over the next 6 months. And there will be time for questions and for sharing at the end of the presentation. So if you would like to stay around for that, there's going to be refreshments, but we'll also have a chance for you to raise any questions that you've been pondering yourself or any comments that you would like to make. Very good. So who am I? Now, I realize that I am kind of getting prematurely gray. Okay, so I am not on one of these pictures up here. All right, so I'm only 42 years old. Okay, so but who am I? Well, this is a really good photo that captures a little bit about who I am. Does anybody have any sense of who the person in the middle is on this photo? Any guess? So clearly it's a bishop, right? So this is Archbishop McNicholas. He was Archbishop for a number of years, but particularly back in the 1930s. The man to his right or our left is actually the founder of the community that I belong to, the Glenmary Home Missioners. That man is Father William Howard Bishop. So Father Bishop, back in the 1930s, he was a diocesan priest in the Diocese of Baltimore, was in his first pastorate, and he was praying in a chapel, and he received, through the gift of the Holy Spirit, a charism to start a missionary community whose sole task was to go to the over 1,000 counties in the United States at that time, in the Appalachia and in the Southeast, that had absolutely no Catholic presence. No church, no Catholic church, no Catholic priesthood, almost no Catholic presence. So Father Bishop felt, my gosh, the U.S. right now is sending people, missioners, all over the world, but who is attending to these counties of the United States where people have never heard of the Eucharist? They've never met a priest in their life. They've never had the opportunity to confess their sins. They've never experienced the fullness of Catholicism. So having received that charism, he had to find a bishop somewhere in the world who would support him in starting this community, the Glenmary Home Missioners. And just to be honest, he got rejected constantly, over and over again. He would go to all these bishops, he'd be like, I've got this idea, and the Holy Spirit's touched my heart, and they would look at him and say, no, I don't think so. You need to move on. And so he actually got really, really frustrated, and at times I think he was quite disillusioned. But he landed on the man who is pictured here, the Archbishop of Cincinnati at that time, McNicholas. McNicholas invited him to come for a visit, and he said to him, absolutely. I want you to start this community, the Glenmary Home Missioners, as it would come to be, right here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. I'm going to give you some land. I'm going to give you a parish, and you can start recruiting. You can even go into the seminary, invite people to join the Glenmary Home Missioners. And so Glenmary had its founding in 1939, right here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And so for almost 85 years now, we've been sending missioners, priests, brothers, and lay people down into the South, into Appalachia, into the Southeast, to counties where there's never been an official Catholic presence. And we've been starting communities, Catholic communities, because of Archbishop McNicholas's generosity in welcoming us to this diocese to start the community. So for myself, who am I? I'm a Glenmarian, and I am completely indebted to the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, to you all, to your history and who you are, because without you, the Glenmary Home Missioners would likely not exist. So for me, then to have the opportunity to go around the Archdiocese and to share something which is important to me is, in fact, I feel, being able to give back to a place that has meant so much for us in Glenmary. Now, Cincinnati has become a home. I've been here for 5 years. I'm serving as our Vicar General, Director of Formation. I do some research on the side, but most of it is kind of like glorified administration. I work with Chris Phelps, who's our Development Director in the back there, who is wonderful. Chris keeps us all sane. She's very good at what she does. It's great working with her. Most of what I do is administration, but Cincinnati has become a real home to me. So for instance, I have to say that who am I? Well, I'm somebody who loves Graeter's ice cream. Easily the best, I think, best ice cream in the world. In my opinion, I've had ice cream on a lot of places. It's exceptional. Whenever family comes to visit, I take them there. I like the Buckeye Blitz. Anybody like the Buckeye Blitz? Oh my gosh. Okay, at least there's a couple of us. All right. Excellent. So it's wonderful. Graeter's is wonderful. But I have to confess, you know, we all have to go through conversion, okay? So here's a confession that I would like to make. I've been here for 5 years and I'm struggling, I'm trying, okay? But to me, this is not chili, okay? So I'm so sorry to say that. I hope you don't throw me out of here. I don't know what this is, but people say it's chili. For me, it's not chili. But in any case, I still will eat it. I'll bring my family to get Skyline or whatever it is, because I know this is really important in the area. But I still have a lot of growth to kind of go through in my own life, right? In any case, Cincinnati is a wonderful place. Who am I as well? Well, I am somebody, as you can imagine, who's been wrestling with this theme of polarization for some time. And I'd like to share a little bit about my story, because I think it can connect to perhaps much of what other people have experienced living within the United States, particularly over the last 8 to 10 years or so. So I was ordained back in 2012. And I was sent to my first mission placement in East Tennessee. And I served in 2 counties that before that time actually had no Catholic church. So it was a very Glenmary experience. I served there for 2 years. And in 2014, my superior said to me, Aaron, we'd like you to go over to Belgium, study, and get your PhD at the Catholic University of Louvain, which is pictured here. Now, I thought, okay, from the mountains of Tennessee to the city of Louvain in Belgium. Okay, wonderful. What a great blessing. So I hopped on a plane, flew from the United States, landed in Brussels, took a train to Leuven, and Leuven became my home for a number of years. Now, Belgium provided with me, I think, a number of true blessings, okay? So the first blessing that I experienced there came in the form of a waffle. Okay, in Belgium, they have waffles. They don't call them Belgian waffles, right? They just call them waffles. And anybody been to Belgium before? Okay, so that's wonderful. Now, if you have a chance, you got to go. The waffles are amazing. They like melt. They're just so wonderful. And then they put this dark Belgian chocolate over the top of it, so that you could like eat it with a spoon if you really wanted to. So I must have had thousands of these Belgian waffles when I was over there. I was a lot heavier than I am right now. My cholesterol is off the charts. But nevertheless, you know, I had to partake. Another blessing that Belgium, not that you would all be interested in this, that another blessing that Belgium provided for me is their beer. Okay, so their beer. Now, Belgian beer, I would say, is probably some of the best beer in the entire world. Okay, part of it is they've been brewing beer there with the same recipe for about 500 to 600 years. So they've got it to perfection. Right. So now, for the sake of, you know, market research, I had to partake when I was over there, right, in order to experience the true Belgian experience. And it was wonderful, right? So between the waffles and the beer, it's amazing that I got any of my studies done. But I promise you, I did work on my dissertation when I was there. And the final, I think, blessing that Belgium provided for me was really a reprieve. I think it provided me a break from what was happening back in the United States at that time, between 2014 and 2018. I immersed myself in European culture, history, art, theology, architecture, and it was truly a blessing. Well, then in the latter part of 2017, I got that phone call from my superior, and he said, well, you know, Aaron, we think you're eating too many waffles and drinking too much beer, so it's time to come back to the United States, and you need to finish your dissertation while you become a pastor of 2 mission parishes in Eastern North Carolina. Now, I'm very obedient, right? So I said, okay, no problem. Got on a plane, flew back to the United States, started to serve in Eastern North Carolina. And I tell you the truth, I don't know if it was because I had a break of 4 years or what it was, but I could feel that something had changed in this country. I could sense a deepened, intensified polarization and division. The anger, the vitriol, the infighting. And I saw it everywhere. Honestly, I was shocked. I saw it everywhere. So I saw it, first of all, in my extended family. People who I love, right? I saw folks sharing posts online of things they would never say in person. They were so mean. And I'm like, who is it? It's almost like this person seemed like they were possessed by a demon with the things that they were saying and sharing. I heard from people and their experience in family that people had got to fisticuffs. They got physically violent with each other because they heard that this person voted for this person or that person voted for that person. So violence within families amongst people who love each other and share the same blood. Of course, I also heard about what was going on in the church, and I experienced it to some extent by myself. A lot of priest friends of mine, they would say, no doubt about it, whole groups of people were leaving their parishes because they could not worship in the same place with somebody who voted for fill in the blank. I knew the experience of priests. I never had this happen to me personally, but my friends would say to me, they would preach a homily on a Sunday. They would try their best to do so right from the scriptures and from the gospel. And somebody would come out as they were greeting them after church, and the person would say, you're secretly supporting the Republicans. The next person that would come in line, you're secretly supporting the Democrats. And they would be like, I don't know what to do, right? These guys were exhausted and tired and trying their best, but they didn't know what to do to try to kind of hold things together. Now, I think one of my sins at times is the sin of arrogance. I thought, I was in Belgium for 4 years, I'm working on my PhD, so I'm all special. I am not going to get sucked into any of this. I can be able to stay above the fray, if you will. I'm not going to have polarization affect me. And immediately, I saw polarization working in my own heart. And it was crazy, right? Because it wasn't there when I was in Belgium for those 4 years. And now all of a sudden, a particular church leader in the United States would share a post online or say something publicly, and all of a sudden I'd start getting upset. My heart would be palpitating, my blood pressure would be rising. A politician would come on the news, and I'd feel like I would just want to swear or go off the mark, right, and just say some things. And then I found I was so much less charitable in talking to people who saw the world differently than I did. And I remember I had a run-in with one of my fellow Glenmaryans, something that I was not proud of. And after that run-in, it didn't go very well. I remember saying to myself, what in the world is happening? What is happening? What's happening in me? What is happening in our country? What is happening in our families? What is happening within our church? So I started to study the theme of polarization, and really to do so kind of as a hobby. I didn't have a whole lot of extra time. I was pastor at that time, finishing my dissertation. And then I was elected to the council to serve in Glenmary's leadership. And I had the freedom to start giving some talks. And I did so at the seminary and also some little retreats on the theme of polarization. And I was connecting it into some of the things I wrote about in my dissertation. And I remember it was at some point in one of the retreats, an elderly woman came up to me, and she was kind of, coming up on with her walker, and she was kind of all hunched over, and she just got in front of me. She pointed to me in my face, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get a mouthful right now. I didn't know what was going to happen. And she says, Father, you really should write a book on this. You should really write a book on this. I didn't think it was going to be something I would have the time to do. But I decided after that prompting to really consider it, and so put myself to write the book, which is the church's mission in a polarized world. I think for sure that this is a small contribution to what is right now a huge problem going on in this country. I did not think that a book that I would write would be so widely and well received by people. I did not anticipate that at all. But I have had so many people come up to me, and this is just to relay to you what this has meant to them. And they'll hold the book and they'll say, Father, because of your book, I am now talking to my sibling that I have not talked to in years because we have had a falling out. I've had people come up with the book and say, Father, I decided to get together with 3 or 4 of my best friends, and we started a book club together, and we went through your book chapter by chapter. And it was the first time in years, where we feel like we have actually started to speak to each other and listen and try to disagree better and try to understand really who we each are and what is the perspective that we come from. So what I'd like to do then is kind of begin to show what are some of the big questions that are within the book that I wrestled with and I'm still wrestling with now. And then also the questions that I think that we will hopefully wrestle with together, not only this evening, but as we go forward. So the first question, why have people ended relationships over politics? All across the United States, I've been talking to different groups, and a consistent thing that I run into is somebody will come up to me afterwards and they'll be in tears. My daughter never comes around anymore because we had an argument about politics. People who've said, the parish where my family lived their whole life, where my grandparents were a part of it, my parents were a part of it, we stopped going because we had a falling out with somebody from the parish. The church is the sacrament of unity. It's such a beautiful phrase that comes to us from the Second Vatican Council. What that phrase means is that when people look upon the church, when they see the church, they should see the unique place in the world where human beings are united sacramentally with God and with each other. What a beautiful gift if we live that we can give to the world. And yet why? Why so many times are Catholics in the United States a source of division and vitriol rather than the unity and charity that God desires for us? And I'm that way too sometimes, right? No doubt about it. Another beautiful aspect of our life as Catholics, to be Catholic is to be missionary. You know, the last 10 years, we've talked so much about being missionary disciples, right? And we've leaned into this idea that to be missionary is to go out. And Jesus says, go out to all the nations. So we should be propelled by our faith to go out really without borders, right? To any group. But for us, sometimes because of polarization, it's even challenging us just to be around people who see the world differently. So Jesus says, go to the nations. And we say, well, I'll go to that group, but I'm not going to go to the Republicans. I'm not going to go to the Democrats. I'm not going to go to that person who sees that they want the liturgy to be that way. I'm not going to go to the person who really likes Pope Francis but doesn't like Pope Benedict. So we're asked to go out, and yet we start limiting ourselves on who we're actually going to be missionary disciples to in our life. Other big questions. Across the United States, in this diocese too, we have diverse parishes, like no doubt about it. And sometimes we put labels on those parishes, and I think that those labels always fall short. Like we say, we have the traditional parish, we have the progressive parish, we have the parish of devotions, we have the parish of social outreach, right? So we put these labels, right? It's kind of part of who we are as Catholics. It's probably not the healthiest thing, but the worst part is that now today, people from these parishes feel that they are at war with other members of the body of Christ simply because they belong to a different parish within the same diocese. I hear this from people who contact me all over the place in the United States, that this is happening in their diocese. Another question, I think if you come away with anything from this evening, I would suggest that we really lean into this question because it is at the heart of what we can do ourselves to counteract some of the challenges of polarization. Polarization makes us want to say, they are the ones to blame, right? They are the ones that need to change. They are the problem. They're the one ruining the United States. They're the ones that are wrecking the church. They're the one, I love it. People will say to me at some time, Father Aaron, you need to buy your book for those people over there. I mean, I love that, right? So I hear that often, like, please bring your book to them. The greatest question that any of us can ask, and I ask this for myself all the time, it's how this research has changed my own life. How have I contributed to polarization? How have I become polarized? I think the more we think about this and the more we reflect upon it, we begin to see the ways in which sometimes I think it's not because of things we've chosen to do, but it's because of the culture we're living in. Sometimes I think we contribute very directly to deepening polarization in the world around us. A couple of other questions. Jesus said, love your enemies. Sometimes I wish he didn't say that, okay? I mean, really, honestly, I really wish he didn't say. If he said, love, continue loving your friends, I think I can handle that. Maybe I can love my family. Maybe I can love the men in my Glenmary community, right? But he says, love your enemies, right? What does polarization do? Well, polarization makes us not want to love our enemies, but we want to harm them. And in increasing ways in this country, we're beginning to see our political enemies as having subhuman characteristics, if not being not human themselves, right? That's a scary place to be in as a country. We've seen throughout history what has happened when one group has seen another group to be less than human. Why does it feel times that we as a country are close to civil war? You can just Google that. You'll find that many articles are written right now about how close the United States is to a new civil war. Now, what will that look like? Nobody knows, but it can't be good, right? And there is a reason why people are so concerned right now, more than at any time probably in our history since the Civil War itself. The 1960s were bad as well. But so many people now are saying the United States is close to the precipice. And actually, if you look at the statistics, more and more people actually want there to be a cessation, that people will split off from this country so that the country can go in separate directions. So kind of trying to think a little bit now more hopefully, right? How does our tradition invite us to respond to the challenge of polarization? One of the greatest things for me is that I looked at this theme and really in the first part of the book started to develop, what does it mean for us to be polarized? Then to kind of pivot into our own tradition. And our Catholic tradition is abundantly rich with resources that it provides to us to try to tackle the challenge of polarization, the Eucharist being one of them, which we will look at together. This is a great question. Can we learn to disagree better? I think we've come to a place where if I have a disagreement with you, I can't just disagree with you. Well, now I have to hate you and I have to distance myself from you. And maybe I even have to do harm to you just because I have a disagreement. Can we learn to disagree better? Can we actually determine what it actually is that we disagree about? This is something I'm terrible at sometimes. I presume that I actually know what it is that you think about your faith, or you think about politics, or you think about this country, so on and so forth. But I don't have the courage myself to really sit down and say, can you help me understand what it is you think or believe or how you feel or what your story is? Catholics oftentimes will speak that same question saying, can we speak the truth in charity? No doubt about it. Speaking the truth is very important for us, but we are to do so in charity. And that implies that we have to have some kind of a relationship with the person that we are engaging. If you think about the people who've had an impact on your life and perhaps helped me to see the world differently, maybe even to see my faith more profoundly, I would say almost certainly it's because I've had a relationship with that person. Think about our mentors and those who have helped us to grow. And a great question, one that I think can propel us into this state of curiosity. Do I believe deep down inside that I have something to learn? If I go into a conversation and I think I kind of know it all and have it all put together, that's going to close down that opportunity. And I think we'll oftentimes really miss what other people have to share with us. Then finally, the big question really is, what is Jesus asking us to do? I think for us as Catholics, it's okay for us to think about, how to react civilly within society. That's a very important word. But I do believe that we need to turn into our faith, because I think Jesus really can inspire us to think differently about the polarized times that we're living in, and will give us the help to do so. So all of that can seem quite overwhelming. Like, I know it to be the case. I feel it at times myself. But there are answers, okay? There are answers. And so I want to just talk a little bit about and point us in the direction of a few of those answers that I think I'll be able to share with you all, and then also in further sessions. So how do I approach this theme? I think, first of all, we need to believe in grace, because the thing we are encountering is very difficult, and we cannot do it ourselves in our own humanity. Grace will have to be a part of the way in which we respond, and to believe that God's grace is going to go before us and is going to help us and is going to guide us out of this challenge that we are facing. The second thing is, I do not approach this subject from a partisan perspective. Almost everywhere I go when I'm giving a talk, it's almost always the case that somebody's wondering, what party is Father Aaron secretly supporting, right? And I get, people will ask me this as well, right? And sometimes they're of course I'll say to them, that's not my role as a Catholic priest, but my approach here is not going to be partisan. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you which party to support. Some of y'all maybe want me to do that. There are many people who come up to us as a priest and say, Father, just tell me what to do on this next ticket. Tell me who to vote for, right? So I think it's important in certain contexts for us to talk about issues. I think it's important for us in context to talk about particular politicians and parties. That's not my approach. It's not my approach. My approach, I believe, is to provide what I would call a spirituality. So sometimes in politics, we'll talk about who to vote for or what to think about an issue, but mine is the how. How are we being called right now to treat each other? And I think that's the thing that we are missing the most strongly, even within the church. And if we get the how, if we get the spirituality right, then we can start having more engaging and more important and deeper conversations around the challenge that we all experience living in a polarized age, such as we do in the United States. But I think we have to get the spirituality right. And that's really what I try to do in my talks, as well as in the book that I wrote. And the final thing to my approach here is I am very concerned about us as Catholics being Catholics. Like my life centers around the church. I mean, I drink the Kool-Aid, right? I'm a priest, so I'm there. And so, look, I understand the political situation and politics is important, and I understand the parties and they can be important as well. And I know the history of the country, and that's good. But my main concern is that we as Catholics keep returning to what it means for us to really be Catholic, particularly in the age in which we are living. Now, to give you a little bit of a sense of how do we get an idea around what is polarization, I'm going to provide 3 images. Now, these are in no way going to exhaust what it is that we mean by polarization. The next talk, which is going to take place at Xavier, at Bellarmine Chapel. Bellarmine Chapel, that's the word. That's going to be a deep dive into the complexity of what polarization is. But I want to leave you all with 3 images, because I think these 3 images, really help us think about the challenge of polarization. So the first is this image here, all right? We might say that polarization can be on a macro level, so on a broad level, understood as 2 massive hurricanes forming over the United States. Okay, that's a very ominous kind of thing to think about, right? But I think it is actually very accurate. Okay, and so I play off of this image of a hurricane, two hurricanes really, throughout each chapter of the book that I wrote. And I can't get into all the details here, but why do I say this? I say this because our culture has developed now in 5 or 6 decades where things have changed such that these two storms, these two polarized groups exist in ways in the United States that they did not exist 50 or 60 years ago. And whenever there's a hurricane, anybody lived through a hurricane here? So I lived through a hurricane in Eastern North Carolina. I'm from Minnesota originally, and nothing in Minnesota can prepare you for going through a hurricane. I mean, it is unbelievable. When a hurricane is forming and coming after you, it dominates your whole life, right? I mean, you cannot think outside of it. And of course, when it gets near, it twists, it turns, it sucks you, it impacts you, it affects you, sometimes in ways that we are even unaware that it is doing so, in particular in ways that we don't want it to impact us. In the United States, what we oftentimes call cultural polarization, there are things that are happening to all of us simply by living in the United States that are actually deepening polarization within our own hearts and in our own minds, oftentimes in an unconscious way. So I'm going to unpack those things, particularly in the next talk a month from now. But just to think about that, so those two hurricanes are floating over the top of us, and even in this moment are affecting us. They're affecting our families, they're affecting our churches, they're affecting our priests, our bishops, they're affecting the way that we're organizing our society. That's oftentimes called the macro reality. On the other hand, we have the micro reality, that we have this cultural situation that is up above us like these two storms, but polarization also affects us deeply personally. And it does so in two ways. On one way is that there is what's called cognitive polarization. So polarization affects the mind. And when polarization is triggered inside of us, for lack of better words, we become dumber, okay? We become dumber. So the blinds close in on us and we see the world in a myopic way, right? We close our minds off to different ideas, different questions, different people, different ways of seeing the world, and we focus very specifically on where we feel safe and what is comfortable. Oftentimes this is called groupthink, right? When we're in groups, we oftentimes won't challenge the way our groups think because we're very afraid as human beings of being ostracized because our groups are so important to us. So polarization tends to close the blinders and make us see less of the world around us. So it cognitively impairs us. And the second part of that is what's called affective polarization. We can't think of polarization just in terms of ideas. We have to see polarization as affecting our emotions. And these are all the emotions that we talked about in the beginning, and we have to take them very seriously. So when we engage with somebody, perhaps from another political party, we have to remember that probably they're feeling afraid too. Probably they're feeling disillusioned as well. Probably they're feeling grievance inside. Probably they're feeling upset. And if we don't attend to those emotions, affective polarization, we're not going to be able to, in a sense, build the unity that I think God desires us to build. So on a very personal level, polarization affects the mind and it affects the heart. And then the third image, which is what I call the logic or the cycle of polarization. And it looks something like this, okay? So there's an us, right? And I'm going to move a little bit away from the camera just for the sake of this. So there's an us, and I like you guys to look great, so I'm gonna join with you, and we all think the same, right? So we think similarly, and we feel safe when we're together. So we're gonna build a fortress, okay? And we're gonna live with inside this fortress or this silo. And we're gonna wall ourselves off from the rest of the world because this is where we feel safe, and this is how the logic of polarization oftentimes plays itself out in our lives. Well, we're looking inside of our fortress, right? And, we're looking out these wonderful windows here, and we start to see a them. It's these people over here for sure, right? Look at them. They're so different than we are, right? They must have problems, no doubt about it. And look, they're building a fortress for themselves as well, right? And they're walling themselves off from us. They're separating themselves from us. And before we know it, what is deep inside us as human beings, as social psychologists will say, is the us versus them mentality. I hang with my group. I protect my group. I think like my group. And I want to punish, harm, and stay away from the other group. We see this happening all over in so many different ways. It's within our families. It's within our political parties. It's within our churches. It's between presbyterates. It's in religious communities. It's like a rod that's pounded down through every area of our life. And if we are not aware of it, or if we're not cautious, it can start to consume us. And worse yet, we start to throw bombs across, right? Trying to affect the other group and destroy them as best as we can. Oftentimes they're verbal bombs, but as we know, sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's worse. This is the logic or the cycle of polarization that continues to play itself out in our country. So there are reasons for hope. The first is, sorry?
What about gossip? Who's playing gossip? I think you hear a lot of that.
There's a lot of gossip, and I'll touch on that. I will touch on that question in just a second. So thank you. So he asked about what about gossip, and I think I'm in a religious order, so we know a lot about gossip. Okay, so it's just who we are. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the first thing I just want to mention, I think it's providential that we're in a Eucharistic revival right now. Okay, I believe that the Eucharist is the antidote to polarization, where polarization means distance and dehumanization and separation and animosity. Eucharist means communion and unity and curiosity and listening and sacrifice, even when there is disagreement. I think the fact that you are all here is a significant reason for hope. I just want to say this. Y'all right now are part of a movement. You're part of a movement. You're part of a movement that I have witnessed and been a part of and seen all across the United States. And I'm not exaggerating. People just like yourselves, in small groups like this one, and in large groups of people of hundreds and sometimes thousands, who are just as concerned about what is going on and who really want to do something. I think it's quite possible that historians will be able to write about our time 50, 100 years from now and say, there were small groups of people concerned about the challenge of polarization. There were faith communities. There were people who didn't have faith, who also were concerned. And these are the people that stood up to try to bring about unity when the country was breaking apart. And there are so many inspirational people that I will refer to, not only from our tradition, but also from other faith groups, other religions, other denominations, people who are involved in this great thing of trying to build unity in a polarized world. To just give you a sense of the talks then going forward. So this is the introduction. A lot of questions, a lot of tensions. Talk 2 is going to take place at Bellarmine at Xavier University. This is going to be a deep dive into the weeds, if you will, of the very important aspect, which is how have things changed in the last 50 or 60 years to get us to the point sociologically, philosophically, within politics as well, to where we are in what we would call a polarized world. So that's going to be the next talk next month. And then I'm going to pivot into 3 themes which are central to the theology of the Eucharist. The first is the theme of presence. So when we think about Eucharist, we think about real presence, right? The presence of Christ. Well, a polarized world invites us to see the other as repugnant and therefore stay away. But the Eucharist invites us to go and be present among the other, the ostracized, just as Jesus is right now, present among us in tabernacles throughout the world. The next Talk 4, we'll look at the theme, which is fellowship or communion. Polarization oftentimes wants us to be excluded or divided. And I'm going to have us think about, what does it mean for us to build fellowship with people who see the world differently than we do, so that that fellowship can hopefully lead to the fullness of unity or communion that we talk about as Catholics. Talk 5 is going to look at that theme of sacrifice, so that within the Eucharist, Christ is ever being sacrificed as he was on the cross. And what does it mean for us to live a life of sacrifice in a polarized world? Well, I think it means resisting wanting to dominate people who are different than us. And finally, because sometimes this can all seem so overwhelming, we might feel tempted to despair. I'm going to talk about the connection between the Eucharist and hope, as well as thanksgiving. So at that point, I'll say to you all, thank you very much. So it's about 8 o'clock right now. I have a couple of questions here, but I am willing to entertain any questions that you all have at this time. So the question I have here, if you want to say something about, what brought you here this evening, feel free to do so. If you would like to talk about how do you feel you have contributed to, that might be a little bit difficult for us to say, but how do you feel you've contributed to or perhaps been affected by polarization? That would be a great question to hear from people. Or if you simply just want to ask me a question, that would be fine as well. Yes, sir.
You gotta tell me what your dissertation was on.
Okay, that's an easy enough question to answer. It was called the. Oh, sorry, great. Yeah, so he asked me that what my dissertation was on. So it was in systematic theology, and it was called Missionary Options for a Secular Age. So it was on the theme of secularization. And then it looked at what is an appropriate missiological or missionary response to the challenges that are around. And I used a lot of different theologians, but the primary theologian I looked at was the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. He has a triptych, if you will, a series of 3 parts with many volumes in each of them. His middle part of that series is called the Theodrama. So it's a lot about God's engagement with us and our engagement with God and in the world. So I used the Theodrama when I looked at that in my own work. Now, polarization is kind of a cousin, maybe an ugly cousin of secularization. So it was an easy way to kind of relate the 2 themes from the dissertation as well as the new research on polarization. So thank you. Other thoughts, other questions? Anybody want to make a confession about how they polarize the world? Yes, Jill.
Especially what younger kids are on Instagram or TikTok have often, there's these big reactions to things, and then suddenly everyone else gets mad, and everyone watching it gets mad, and so I was wondering if you had a comment.
Yeah, so the question was about the effects of social media on polarization, and I cover that in a section in the book that I wrote, and I think it's maybe the easiest way to say is that there is an incentive for those who make money off of social media to have the algorithms of social media set such that the things which keep us engaged the most continue to get put forward, because the more we're on, the more money they get in terms of revenue. And a lot of they do lots of research on this themselves, and some of the research has been leaked actually, but the thing which gains them the most attention of our eyes tends to be stuff that really gets us upset, tends to be posts that are extremely negative. It tends to be discussions that are really vitriolic, and you get a lot of people that weigh in. And the algorithm is just set to keep putting that in front of our faces. And so there are a lot of studies, one thing on mental health and related to social media, that people tend to feel a lot worse about themselves in the world when they spend time on social media. And that, again, that's a generalization based on research, but it's part of that, constantly seeing the negativity that exists there. So there's been attempts that people have said, maybe certain social media companies should regulate their algorithms in such a way that could dampen down or lessen the polarization. And sometimes they've done that and it has actually worked, but then they go back to the original way the algorithm is set up because they want the money. So it's a huge issue. And I'm not an expert on that, but that's certainly the best I could do. Yeah. Other question? I thought I saw a hand go. So I want to mention, sir, you brought up the concept of gossip. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the use of language. So I think one of the challenges of polarization is that, I'll just say very, very specific example. You're sitting around the dinner table and you're with a group of people that you kind of think the same way as you do about the world. And somebody will start saying, well, it's all those Trumpers, right? Or it's all the Democrats or the progressives. So right there, the use of language is already othering people. So what it's doing, it's taking a whole group of people and lumping them together when we know it's just the case that everybody's different. You can't say that every Republican sees the world this way, every Democrat sees the world this way, but immediately our use of language, making hasty generalizations and what they call othering people, can be really detrimental, because what happens then is I fail to see you as the individual that God has made you to be. It oftentimes, othering people shuts down my curiosity. So I think, I know all about your world, therefore I don't even have to talk to you, I don't even have to ask you. I already have you figured out. But none of us like to have that done to us, right? But what happens in Polarized World is we do that to each other. Whereas I think the challenge is to really cultivate a deep sense of curiosity. And then when we're at the table and somebody makes an othering comment like that, to just say, I wonder if there's another way that we could talk about this group of people or that particular person. And then already doing that, we're inviting nuance into the discussion and into the conversation. And I think challenging ourselves to see the world in a more profound way. So it's great. And I think gossip is really an offshoot of that, right? Making generalizations about a person or sharing information about others, which is really trying to cut them down. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, but probably something we shouldn't be sharing. So other thoughts, other questions? Yes, sir.
Primaries, like election primaries, how they seem to.
So the question is about how election primaries contribute to polarization. So there are a number of ways to, I think, answer this question, and I think I would proffer just the following. Just as there's an incentive for social media companies to promote negativity and vitriol and anger because that keeps us engaged, so it is the case in politics that the people, and there's research on this, and I touch on it in my book, but there are the people who are the most engaged in politics. So it's not everybody, but those who are the most engaged. And what they mean by that, the ones who are willing to go door to door, put up yard signs, give money, go to a rally. Those who are most engaged are the ones that are most riled up by anger and hatred for the other group. So there is an incentive for politicians, and that's partly why we see so much negative campaign ads, particularly during primary seasons, but also during the general election. Politicians know, based on the research, that if you want to get people involved, most likely to get involved, you create a clear enemy of the other person, and you say that they're going to ruin the world and the country, and that gets us very nervous. And when we're very nervous and anxious, we tend to get involved, and sometimes in unhelpful ways. So that's just kind of one way that I answer that question. So thank you. Other thoughts, other questions? Yes, sir.
And Gabby, I wonder how much this fear, the general fear that the other side will ruin all I care about, whatever side it is based on the two factors that Gaudium et Spes talks about, especially in the third section. One is the concentration of power in the hands of very few people who have almost, it says in one part, that they have almost complete ability to rule over their own domains, while most people have little to no participation in social and economic life. And the other is that people feel like they have no hope unless they can become part of an increasingly small group that does determine, like, the increasingly small group of people. I wonder if that's part of it, that is a great influence on polarization.
So in all honesty, I haven't thought about that or made that connection. So it's an interesting point. And the question referred to Gaudium et Spes in particular, if the fear that people feel inside and the anxiety is related to the fact that so few people have most of the power and have the ability to really affect our lives and change the way things are. And sometimes we don't feel like we have that or share that. And so therefore, we are anxious about the decisions that those people with power can make. So, and I would just say that in the book, I talk about this idea called the mega identity. So what has happened is that people have sorted themselves into the two political parties, and they've done so not just through the party, but also geographically, racially, religiously, and culturally, so that the two groups now have very few things that overlap. And both of these groups, these quote unquote mega groups, which I'm going to get into in next month's talk, both of our political mega groups now share so little in common that if one of these groups gets in power, it can feel like the world's going to come to an end because of the decisions that they could make that could truly impact the way of life of this other group. Okay, and that there's a lot of fear there, which is why people say today, and sometimes I think we feel it, that every election is the most important election ever. But just imagine this now. I mean, think about, empathize with the other group that you maybe are not a part of, right? So, and think about somebody, let's say, who's gay and married. Okay, so if the other party that they don't belong to is going to get in power and is saying, we are going to take away your ability to be married, that really affects your life, whether you think whatever you think about gay marriage one way or the other. But just to empathize how deep and profound that would affect a person inside. Or flip the script a bit. Think about somebody who really believes that within a woman that exists that's a child. Okay. And that if the so-called other party gets into power, that they may even try to make sure that more of those children in the womb die, right? So again, I'm not saying one thing one way or the other about abortion. That's not my point here. The point is just to empathize with one group or the other of how much fear people can have because of the way a decision can be made by so few people. And that ratchets up the intensification of polarization. I think it's important. That's affective polarization, right? That's what we feel deep inside. So it's a great question. So thank you. Other ideas, other thoughts, comments? Yes, ma'am.
Polarization, right? So I guess my question is is polarization something new? Because there was a lot of polarization, in the 1900s, the civil rights movement and women's suffrage. And then if polarization has always been here, then can we ever get to a place of truth?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. And I am no expert on history. So, I think a historian would be able to answer the question with far more nuance than I could. So I just came off of a civil rights pilgrimage last week. And so we were down in Birmingham and Montgomery and Jackson and Memphis, and it was just an extraordinary event. So, and I think you're right. So think about in the 60s, right? So there was division at that time, and people were bombing churches. So we visited the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 girls who were going to Sunday school were in the basement and somebody's dynamite bomb went off, right? And killed the 4 girls and maimed another one. So I think in a sense, you could say, well, I guess thankfully, right now we're not setting off a lot of bombs in different places, although there is the emergence of both the threat of violence, and then of course we know January 6th and other events where people have lost their lives. So it's difficult to compare different epochs. I would argue and what other people who are kind of more informed on this than I am, I would argue that our way is different for a number of reasons. And I'm going to get into those more specifically in the next talk. But one of them is the onset of social media. Like we just cannot discount the effect that has had. And again, the proliferation of information and also the information anonymously. And now if you bring in artificial intelligence and the way that we're not going to really know what is actually true or not. So that makes it even more complicated. Now, the question is, though, because of some of this happening online, is our rage and outrage in our violence only performative rather than actually lived, right? So they actually put a bomb in a church and blew it up 60 years ago. We want to drop verbal bombs to people online and threaten that, right? But so the question is social media maybe a lessening or dampening some of the actual violence that could take place? So that's one thing to think about, and I think that's important. The other thing is that what is certainly the case today is that we have sorted geographically and politically and religiously in the United States in ways that are unprecedented. And that took place back in the 60s, actually, with the civil rights movement, where in the 60s you had the Dixiecrats, so the Democrats that were Southern, and they were actually kind of quote unquote conservative, and they were Christian. And they were very much partnering with people in urban areas, right? And then after civil rights, there was this movement where all of a sudden you got it to be the case that it's very difficult today to find in rural America somebody who doesn't lean Republican, okay? And so now what if you do have two Americas, you kind of have a coastal America and you have the center of America. And these two groups do not live around each other. There isn't as much diversity of thought within those two groups. And that, I think, presents one of the most dangerous aspects of polarization today, because you do have a rising sense of people who do want the union to split. And that's been documented. So there's a lot of nuance. I think you raised great points. It's always hard to compare and contrast different eras because there's so many, it's like almost like apples and oranges. But I do think we are at a difficult point today, which is important to raise up. So thank you. Very good. So I'm going to be around. There are books in the back. If you're interested, they're 20% off. And if you'd like to buy more than one, you can buy them at $15 a piece. Otherwise, they're $20. And I can sign those if you would like. I'm here also to talk. Chris Phelps has other information about Glenmary if you're interested in more about Glenmary. And just want to say once again, thank you all for taking the time. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the engagement. Thanks for staying awake, which is great. You know, in the evening on a Thursday night, I know that can be tough. So let's just pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We give Father Aaron a huge round of applause. Once again, it's been such a pleasure working on this with you. So again, as he said, there are books in the back, there are snacks in the back. Feel free, we can have some time to eat and commune together. We also have, if you're interested in learning more about our election year programming and beyond, we have a sign-up sheet in the back if you'd like to stay in touch. For those of you online, you are welcome to message me, Jill Foster, in the chat with your name and email. And so just one more round of applause. Thank you so much.